I'll briefly touch on why save seeds, and then we'll get into actual basics of seed saving, including growing for seed, when to harvest, processing, storing, and then sharing seeds after you've saved them. And since seed saving is has so many specific nuances, especially depending on the crop type you're working with, we'll make sure to leave lots of time for questions in the end since it is such a specific thing. It definitely won't be possible to hit on every point tonight. So, Seed Savers Exchange, our mission is to steward America's culturally diverse and endangered garden and food crop legacy for present and future generations. We educate and connect people through collecting, regenerating, and sharing open pollinated seeds, plants, and stories. And the main way we do this is through the exchange, where about 15,000 unique varieties are listed by home gardeners across the United States and Canada mostly. And anyone can sign up for that and list seeds. And if you're signed up, you can also request seeds from other gardeners. And we also have a seed bank where we are preserving 20,000 plus varieties of garden vegetables and fruits. We preserve them, and every year we grow out usually a few hundred varieties for increase, but also to evaluate them and learn more about the plant. And a way many people are familiar with us is through our catalog, which financially supports our preservation work. And so I'm the seed bank manager at Seed Savers Exchange. So a little introduction to the seed bank is we have about 100 different crop types that we preserve. The number one, or the one we have the most varieties of, are tomatoes. Second is beans. And then third, Seed Savers Exchange also has 2 apple orchards. So our third biggest crop that we preserve is actually apples, not as seed. And then 4 is squash. And while we are preserving these seeds long-term in cold storage, we also want to be getting them into the hands of the public. That's the safest place for them to be. And we do that by listing them in the exchange. And last year we distributed right around 2,500 packets of seed from the seed bank. So let's get into it. So why save seeds? Since you're here this evening, of course, you have some sense of why you might want to be saving seeds or why it might be important, or you're at least curious about it. And so there's many reasons to save seeds, but I tried to boil it down into 3 points: connection, practical, and biodiversity and selection. So saving seeds forms connections. Seeds connect people throughout time. These seeds are only here because they've been saved by generations of people before us. And if we're saving them, they will be available for people after us. They connect people through food and culture and story. Every seed has a story, whether we have forgotten it or if we know many details about its story spanning generations. And seeds also connect people with the soil. So here I have a picture of Grandpa Ott's Morning Glories, which is really the variety that got Seed Savers Exchange started when co-founder Diane Ott Whaley realized she was probably the only person still saving these seeds, that she had memories of saving with her grandparents when she was young. And there's a picture of her grandparents, and you can see that they're kind of looking through the Morning Glories in this picture. And so, these aren't just seeds that she purchased. They are seeds that connect her to her grandparents. And they're connected to the people they know before them. And now these seeds will be connecting people in the future too. Why save seeds? It's also just practical. Saves you money, makes you more self-reliant. Today, 60% of seeds in the world are owned by 4 companies. So in the face of that, it makes a lot of sense to build these skills of self-reliance in our communities. And why save seeds? Biodiversity and selection is another huge reason. When you save your own seeds, you can select for desirable traits. If you had a plant that did particularly well, you can save the seeds from that plant. And when you save seeds, they are also going to become adapted to your local climate, your local pests. You won't be saving seeds from the plants that die because it's too dry. You will only be saving seeds from the plants that do well. And also, saving your own seeds promotes biodiversity. And in the face of climate change, this is something that's really important to our future food system. Seeds, biodiversity increases the gene pool of our food and makes it more likely that we will have varieties that are tolerant to extreme weather, whether that's very wet weather, very dry, hot, cold. Also increases the likeliness of having plants that are resistant to diseases and pests. And both diseases and pests are moving around as the climate changes. And I have a picture on this slide here that is just showing kind of the power of human selection. So on the far left, that's the wild relative of domesticated corn, teosint. I think I'm pronouncing that right. But you can see that it just kind of looks like a grass head, not a lot of seeds. But by selecting for more seeds, bigger seeds on these heads, throughout generations, people domesticated corn as we know it today, which you can see on the right. And so I also wanted to show this same concept, but with Brassica oleracea. So cabbage, Brussels sprout, kohlrabi, kale, collards, broccoli, cauliflower, they're all the same plant, but since humans have selected for generations for different traits, we have these plants that seem very different. So saving our own seeds is a really, really powerful tool in feeding and nurturing ourselves. So seed saving basics, let's get into it. Just due to the nature of this topic and how crop type dependent everything is, tonight we'll be focusing a lot on what concepts are important to consider while you're saving seeds. And so these concepts will be different for different crop types, but as long as you know what to consider and what to look out for, you will be able to do a little research into whatever you're specifically growing or wanting to learn more about, and you will be able to successfully save seed and know what you need to know. And thankfully, the essential toolkit for seed saving is something you already have. The first of which being your goals and purposes. So there's every different person can have a different reason or goal or purpose for saving seed. So at Seed Savers Exchange, when we're saving seed, it's for long-term genetic maintenance and distribution to the public. But for home gardeners, your goal or purpose may be to save one variety because it's your favorite and you really enjoy saving the seeds from it. And maybe for someone else, they are a bean collector, and so they like to save lots of bean seeds. So it's just important to be conscious about what and why you're saving seed because that will change how it looks. Your gut. Seed saving is a bit of an art, and it's good to trust your intuition because there's a lot of gray area. And that also goes into creativity. A lot of seed saving solutions are just creative DIY things. So we'll get into that a little more later. And then being present, curious, and observant sounds simple, but so much of good growing and good seed saving is being just very observant. All right, so growing for seed. So before we can save the seeds, There's a few things we need to consider while we're growing the plants that we're wanting to save seeds from. And this is really where we get into thick of, depending on what you're growing, this is going to be wildly different. So we'll look at kind of the top three easy or introductory seed-saving crops: the common bean, tomato, and pea. And then we'll also look at two maybe not so easy crops, squash and corn, just to look more into, well, what makes these not as easy as the others, and to learn more about the different considerations we're looking at. All right, so let's jump into, oh, yes. So as we're looking at this, we are going to be looking specifically at how is the plant pollinated. This could be that it self-pollinates, or the wind, or insects. And depending on how your plant is pollinated, that will greatly affect the isolation requirements for saving seed from this plant to make sure it's not getting crossed up with a different variety. And then another thing to consider while growing for seed is that spacing requirements and maturity can sometimes be different from market growing. And one other thing to think about is how many plants to grow for your seed saving goals. So for Seed Savers Exchange, when genetic maintenance, long-term genetic maintenance is our goal, we're growing a lot more plants than the home gardener would need to grow for seed saving. And that also is something you want to think about with when you're thinking of how much seed you want to harvest. So let's get right into it with beans. So I included on this slide the scientific name, because as we'll see in a bit, there are many crop types with bean in the name that will not cross-pollinate with beans, or common beans, I should say. And the recommended isolation distance for common beans is only 10 feet. That's about as short as it gets. That's basically no isolation required. And this is because beans have a perfect flower, so it has both male and female parts in the same flower. And it is also self-fertile, which means it can pollinate itself. Some plants have a mechanism built in so that it can't fertilize itself, just as a different evolutionary approach to genetics. But beans can. That works just fine for them. And because of this, their pollination is self. So when that flower is open, it is almost certainly already pollinated itself. However, it is possible that insects will visit the flowers, move pollen around, and create some cross-pollination there between varieties. But because the flower is perfect and self-fertile, that is why the isolation distance is so short at 10 feet. So, and beans that's part of the reason why they're easy to save seed from, is you don't have to worry about cross-pollinating so much. And the reason I included the scientific name for the common bean is because they will not cross-pollinate with many other beans, but these other beans have different, they're different species. So you can see lima bean, runner bean, African pea, or cow pea, or southern pea are all names for that one. Fava bean, adzuki bean, tepary bean. These are different crop types that we think of as beans, but they are separate from the common bean. And we only have to worry about the Phaseolus vulgaris cross-pollinating with itself. We don't have to worry about these other kinds of beans. And so one great tip for seed saving is, if you do want to save a seed from a variety, growing only one variety of that crop type is one great way to fix the isolation distancing requirements. So instead of trying to save 10 common beans, you could do a common bean, a lima bean, a runner bean, an African pea, a fava bean, an adzuki bean, tepary bean, all right next to each other, and there won't be any cross-pollination concerns. So the next kind of easy crop to save seed from, and a favorite, of course, is tomatoes. And they also have a very short isolation distance of 10 feet because they also have perfect self-fertile flowers that are frequently already pollinated by the time they open. Um, this picture here is of two tomato flowers, and you can see the one on the left has stigmas sticking out just a little bit. And some varieties of tomatoes have that. And so with those varieties, they are going to be more prone to cross-pollination concerns by insects. But in general, tomatoes, you don't have to be as concerned about that, but it is a possibility. So for peas, the things we want to consider when growing them for seed, they also have a 10-foot recommended isolation distance from any other pea because they are also perfect and self-fertile. So if you haven't noticed, there's a pattern here that the easy seeds to save have perfect flowers that are self-fertile. And so again, once those flowers open, probably already pollinated. Insects can possibly cross-pollinate them, but that's pretty rare for peas. So those were our three kind of top choices for beginner seed savers. And so now let's look at squash, which is a little different. And so when we're saying squash, we're actually talking about 4 different species that I listed out under scientific name. And for the home gardener, we have a recommended isolation distance of at least 800 feet between the same species of squash. And this is because the flowers are monoecious and dependent on insects for pollination, which means you need to uh, create enough space between one variety and another within the same species so that a bee visiting one plant isn't going to go and visit the other one and get the pollen crossed up. And so I included some pictures here of squash being pollinated at Seed Savers Exchange. In the very bottom photo on the right, there's a female flower and someone is pollinating it with a male flower. They have stripped off the yellow flower so that it's just and I don't know the botanical terms for how it is with squash flowers, but where the pollen is, the male part of the flower. And they're just rubbing the pollen all over the female flower to pollinate that. And then in the kind of middle photo on the left, they are then flagging that female flower so that they know it's been pollinated. And they're also taping the flower shut so that they don't have to worry about pollinators coming along behind them and bringing unwanted pollen along with them. Oop. All right, and corn. Now corn is that's a crop type that I don't think would work for many home gardeners in Iowa to save seed from, just because it is a little intensive, and since there's so much corn in this state, there's a lot of pollen in the air. But I wanted to talk about it just because it's an example of a crop type that's pollinated by wind. So the recommended isolation distance for home gardeners is 800 feet, but at Seed Savers Exchange, we hand pollinate all of our corn because we don't want to risk our neighbor's corn pollen coming in and crossing up the corn that we're trying to save seeds from. And so corn have monoecious flowers that are self-compatible, and they're pollinated by wind. So when we're pollinating corn, we bag the tassels to collect the pollen, and then we cover the silks before they emerge and get a chance to be pollinated. And so then We spread the pollen on ourselves and then recover it so that we know that's the only pollen going on those silks. So thinking about pollination and isolation distance is really the biggest thing for when you're planning on how to grow a crop for seed. And kind of the next step is knowing um, when it is ready to be harvested. And so this, again, will kind of come back to just doing your research on what you're growing to know when it's mature. However, there are a few traits to look for that will give you clues. The color of the seed and the fruit, the hardness or softness of the seed and fruit, how easy it is to detach from the stalk, as well as the color of the seed embryo. And so for dry fruited crops such as beans, um, we're gonna want to have a hard seed coat. So if you're harvesting a bean and you stick your thumbnail into it, you shouldn't be able to dent it. Um, it should resist your thumbnail. And so that's a sign that that bean is ready, it is mature, ready to be harvested. You want a dry seed pod. So this picture of bean pods in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the progression from green to kind of yellow to just a totally like desiccated brown color. So we want the seed pod to be totally dry on the plant before we harvest. And another sign that a seed is ready for harvest is when it starts dispersing itself. So I included a picture of what I believe are a Brassica oleracea silique that are opening and releasing seeds. And the plants know when their seeds are ready. And when their seeds are ready, they start to open. So that's a good sign or a good way to know that your seeds are mature, which of course introduces the problem of having a short window of harvest before they all shatter. But as with many things in seed saving, it's just a bit of a balancing act. Another sign that your seed is mature is the color of the seed will change. And so I've included a runner bean in the bottom right-hand corner. And when they are immature, you can see they're bright pink in their green pod, and they're not ready to harvest for this one specifically, until they turn that black with pink mottling. And same concepts for fleshy fruited crops. Most fleshy fruited crops will be ready at or past market maturity. Um, so you'll have to look at the color of the fruit, the size of the fruit, and whether or not the fruit is soft or hard. And some of those, like the cucumber, you want them just about rotted on the vine, and it can get pretty stinky. So, um, once you've identified that your seed crop is ready to be harvested, the next step is going to be processing that seed, which is going to look different if it's a dry crop or a fleshy fruit crop. So we'll start with the dry. And dry processing is very straightforward. You want to do a post-harvest drying, and this could look like fans spreading the seed out in thin layers on screens or just on a surface. You want to make sure to stir them up every day or so, or you might be able to hang it up, depending on what you're doing. If you have something like sorghum or that's still on the stalk, maybe herbs, hanging is a great option. And you just want to make sure you have air movement and that it's out of direct sunlight. And so after that, then will need to separate the good seed from plant material and immature seed, which will be accomplished through threshing, screening, and winnowing. And so threshing is the process of removing the seed from like large plant material. And so here you can see someone's just physically doing that with their hands to break up the seed heads. And threshing, I mean, there's so many different ways of doing this, whether it's putting seed heads into a pillowcase or a sack or a garbage bin and just kind of beating them up either by smacking the bag around, or I've heard of people putting a weed whipper into trash bins with the plant material, turning it on to break it up, or you can use your feet, you can use hammers, mallets. You just want to make sure that whatever method you're using is proportional to the hardness of the seed and the quantity. So different methods are just going to totally vary based on the specific seed and the quantity. Another step to separating seed from all of the chaff is screening. And just a note is to know your screen size, and that's just something that you learn through trial and error. And this part isn't totally necessary. It just depends on your process. But the goal here is to separate the finer plant material from the seed. And so kind of the final process is winnowing, which will separate not only the chaff, but also small, immature, or even empty seeds. And this, again, is just something you need to get creative with based on your seed, the quantity of seed you have, and whatever your setup is. This could be anything from just blowing on seed if you have a small quantity, to pouring it, as you can see in this picture, in front of a gentle fan. And the fan will have enough air movement to take away the lightest materials, which will be the chaff and poor or immature seed. But while the healthy seed will be heavy enough that it will still drop down into your container. And there's just an infinite number of ways to do this, but you're just trying to create airflow to separate the light weighted plant material away from the good seed. So wet processing is kind of broken into 4 different steps here. The first of which is extraction, and then next is fermentation. Third is decanting and rinsing. And then the last is drying the wet seed. And so this process, I think, is more involved than the dry processing. But it's not too bad once you know what concepts you need to be paying attention to. So we'll start by looking at extraction. The things you want to consider for this are you're trying to exclude as much pulp and skin as possible. So if you have, for example, a tomato, and to start the extraction process, I would cut it in half, and then you'd basically just squeeze it, and the seeds and the kind of goopy stuff would come out, but hopefully the really pulpy stuff would stay with the fruit and of course the skin. So we want to try and keep that out as much as possible. And so for large fruit, like I kind of just mentioned with the tomato, you can just cut in half and then scoop it out by hand, squeeze by hand. And then for smaller fruits, a food processor with a dough blade is a great option for kind of getting that separated out. So fermenting, this is a step that is essential for tomatoes and cucumbers. I've had people tell me that they've found it's not necessary for tomatoes, but that's something that For our process, we find rather essential for long-term seed health because the fermentation process helps break down a germination inhibiting layer surrounding the seed. And it's a light fermentation period is good for watermelon, melon, and squash, but not necessary. So for the steps for this fermentation step, you will leave seeds in a juice mixture, just the juice that has come from the fruit. You don't need to add water, and you want to have as little of the fleshy pulp in there as possible and as little skin as possible. And then you leave it in an open container, such as the buckets you see here, in a warm location. Stir it occasionally. And when fermentation is complete, mature seeds will sink to the bottom. However, you may have to stir it first. Yeah, I would always stir to make sure that all the seeds that will sink have sunk. And this whole process can take 1 to several days, just kind of depending on your conditions, how much seed you're working with, and how warm you have it. In the top 2 pictures there, you can see on the left is a tomato seed fermenting mixture just starting out. You can see it's a little moldy, but then on the right-hand side, that's a really good sign that your fermentation is going well. When you get that moldy layer on the top, that is what we're going for. So it's not pretty, doesn't smell great, but it'll get some good seeds. So once your fermentation step is complete, next you'll want to decant and rinse the seeds. So for decanting, we'll just add water and stir and pour off the lighter stuff that floats up to the top. That's going to be empty or immature seeds and other pulpy material that has gotten in, or the like sugars in the juice mixture for fermentation. And so just do that several times. And then after you've decanted, then you'll just rinse the seed off. And so to do that, you just pour them into a colander or a strainer of some sort where the mesh is fine enough that the seeds will not go through, but that other material can kind of be blasted through with a hose or a sprayer. And so this step's important because we don't want any of the like fermented juices on the seeds still, because that can cause them to prematurely germinate because it'll break down that germination inhibiting layer too much. And so then the last step here is simply drying the seeds. Of course, make sure you drain them as well as possible and create a thin layer. We have found that for whatever reason, coffee filters work really well. You can also do screens or mesh bags. And you will just want to think about air movement, either a fan or if you have a location that just naturally has a lot of air movement. And no direct sunlight. Direct sunlight will encourage seeds to germinate. And you'll also want to stir it daily, preferably. So that is just kind of a whirlwind introduction to processing for dry and wet crops. And so something you're going to want to be thinking about throughout this whole entire process is organization. That's kind of, if we're talking about key points to take home, I would say one of those should be just always thinking about organization throughout this process. Documenting throughout growing your plants is so helpful for future years and just for knowledge of this variety. And just labeling, just over labeling everything consistently and thoroughly and legibly. Um, we just go wild with labels at Seed Savers Exchange because we are growing so many different varieties every year. You cannot label enough. And I've learned well, I should have learned by now, the hard way, not to trust oh, I'll remember this later. You probably won't. Uh, and those little details like, oh, I harvested this on this date, can be so important later on. So write everything down that you want to know in the future. So, and one other tip for labeling is we always label the outside of a container when we're putting seed on it. And we also always put a label on the inside in case the outside label becomes illegible for whatever reason or if it falls off. And so when you have properly labeled seed, the next step to think about is storage. And when we're storing seed, we're thinking about them being dry, dark, cold, and we're thinking about pests. So starting with darkness, sunlight activates seeds. It tells them it's time to get going. And it especially activates microbial metabolic activity, which will result in, fungus or the seed rotting. If a storage location is not dark, such as this refrigerator here, which does make a great storage location, um, you can store seeds in containers that don't let light through. So the best option is to have your seeds in a refrigerator or a freezer and your light problem is solved. But if you cannot do that, think of using containers that are not glass or letting light through. And so probably, um, well, very importantly, you need to think about keeping your seeds cold. So for short-term storage, and by short term, we're thinking a year or a few years, refrigerator is probably going to be just fine for you. If you're doing long term, you're definitely going to want a freezer, or if you have room in your freezer anyway, you can certainly store seeds in there, even if it's only going to be for a short term. Basically, the colder, the better. And so some crop types that are notorious for having the shortest storage life are onions and carrots. Those are the crop types that their germination is going to drop really fast. So if you're interested in saving seeds from those crops, you'll definitely want to look at using a freezer. And so another thing to consider with storage is pests. There's nothing more frustrating than working hard to save and process seed and then have it just totally be decimated by pests in storage. So you'll want to think about, is your seed uncovered and is it in a chewable container? If either of those are true, it is totally possible that a rodent or insects can get at it. So beat rodents with thick plastic or glass. And for insects, you'll want to do airtight containers, and temperature is also going to help you, especially if you're freezing the seed. That will also freeze any eggs or little larvae that might be in there with your seeds. And so once you have your seeds all stored away, the next growing season is going to come around and you'll have some for your own uses, but chances are you're going to have plenty of extra. And so what to do with those? Well, one thing you can do is to list them on the exchange, which you can find just on the Seed Savers Exchange website. You can list your own seeds there, and gardeners from across the country can contact you and request those seeds so they can try growing them too. The Community Seed Network is a place really to connect with other seed people. It's not so much a place to list your seeds like the exchange, but it's a place to connect with people who might be interested in your seeds or who will be hosting events such as seed swaps, where you can bring your seeds and get them into people's hands that way. Another option is donating to your local seed library. And of course, sharing with family and friends as seed or as extra transplants.